It was the dead of winter, and a brutal snowstorm had taken hold of the small town. Katie, a 17-year-old girl, was home alone, her mother away on a 3-day business trip. It wasn't unusual. Her mom often had to travel around the holidays, leaving Katie to fend for herself. But this year was different. The storm was worse than anyone had expected, with howling winds rattling the windows and a suffocating blanket of snow covering everything outside. Katie tried to make the best of it. She heated up some leftovers, curled up on the couch, and started a movie. The storm outside was loud, but the comfort of her warm living room helped her relax. That was, until she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the snow, growing louder as they approached her front porch. She froze. Her heart raced as the sound stopped abruptly near the door. The storm howled louder, but she swore she heard someone cough, a raspy, deliberate cough. It sent chills down her spine. She paused the movie and stared at the door, waiting for a knock or the doorbell. Minutes passed, but nothing happened. Against her better judgment, Katie tiptoed to the window and peeked outside. The porch was empty. Her stomach dropped. She could clearly see footprints leading up to her door, deep, deliberate steps in the fresh snow. But there were no prints leading away. Whoever had been there hadn't left. Trying to rationalize, Katie told herself it was probably a neighbor confused by the snowstorm. Maybe they realized their mistake and quietly turned back before she noticed. But deep down, she knew something didn't feel right. The night dragged on, the storm intensifying as the power flickered intermittently. Around 11 p.m., just as Katie was starting to doze off on the couch, a loud thud jolted her awake. It wasn't the wind this time. It was something hitting the side of the house near the kitchen. Her pulse quickened. She grabbed her phone, but the signal was patchy because of the storm. The thudding sound came again, and this time it was louder. Katie turned on her phone's flashlight and crept toward the kitchen. Her mind raced with possibilities: a branch, an animal, or maybe something else. As she rounded the corner, the beam of her flashlight caught something, or rather someone. A man was standing on the other side of the glass door leading to the back porch. Katie gasped, stumbling backward. The man's face was partially obscured by shadows, but his eyes locked onto hers, cold and unblinking. He raised a hand and knocked softly on the glass. "Hey, kid," he said, his voice hoarse. "Can you open the door? It's freezing out here." Every instinct in Katie's body screamed at her to run, but she was paralyzed. The man leaned closer, his breath fogging the glass. "Come on," he pleaded. "Just open the door for a second, please." Katie shook her head, barely able to form words. "No, I can't." The man's expression darkened. His polite demeanor vanished, replaced by something sinister. "Open the door," he barked, slamming his fist against the glass. Katie bolted for her phone and tried to call 911. The call struggled to connect, her signal fading in and out. Meanwhile, the man continued pounding on the door, his shouts growing more aggressive. Finally, after several failed attempts, the call went through. Katie quickly explained the situation to the dispatcher, her voice trembling. By the time the police arrived, nearly 30 minutes later, due to the storm, the man was gone. They found footprints leading from the backyard to the woods, but couldn't track him beyond that. Katie's mom came home the next day, shaken by what had happened. The police never identified the man, and the incident remained a chilling mystery. To this day, Katie wonders, was he just a desperate stranger seeking shelter, or was he something far more dangerous? And the thought that keeps her awake at night? If the storm hadn't delayed the police, would they have found him or her? The highway was eerily empty, swallowed by the endless expanse of white snow that blanketed the world. Michael had been driving for hours, eager to get home before the storm worsened. The wind howled against his car, and the snow seemed to fall heavier with every mile. It wasn't the ideal time to be on the road, but with no signs of other vehicles, He figured he'd make it through if he stayed focused. About halfway through his journey, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving only the faint glow of his headlights to guide him. Just as he started to feel the weight of isolation, he noticed something up ahead. A car stranded on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking faintly through the snow. Michael slowed down, his instincts warring with his sense of responsibility. He couldn't just leave someone out there, not in this weather. As he approached, he saw a man standing beside the car, waving his arms frantically. Michael hesitated for a moment, but the look of desperation on the man's face pushed him to pull over. Rolling down his window just a crack, Michael braced against the freezing wind. "You okay?" he asked. The man leaned toward the window, his breath visible in the icy air. "My car's stuck. Can you help me push it out? It's blocking the road, and I can't get it to move." His voice was strained, as though English wasn't his first language, but his urgency was clear. Michael glanced at the car. It was tilted awkwardly, with snow piled high around its tires. "All right," he said reluctantly. "Let me grab my gloves." The moment Michael stepped out of his car, the cold hit him like a wall. The snow was relentless, soaking through his jacket almost instantly. He pulled his hat down tighter and trudged toward the stranded car. The man followed him closely, staying silent as Michael examined the situation. "It doesn't look too bad," Michael said, brushing some snow away from the rear bumper. "If we both push, it should come loose." But as he waited for the man to join him, Michael realized he was still standing by the driver's side door, rummaging for something in the front seat. The longer the man stayed there, the more uneasy Michael felt. He squinted through the dim light, his breath fogging the air, and called out, "Everything all right?" The man froze for a moment, then turned back with a forced smile. "Just getting my gloves," he replied. Something about his tone didn't sit right with Michael. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a sense of dread began to creep in. As the man finally came around to help, Michael noticed he wasn't looking at the car anymore. Instead, his eyes were locked on Michael, cold and unblinking. Michael's pulse quickened. "Let's make this quick," he muttered, positioning himself at the rear of the car. The man nodded, but didn't say a word. Just as they were about to push, Michael heard a faint sound, voices. They were muffled, almost drowned out by the wind, but unmistakable. He glanced around, his heart racing. "Were you talking to someone earlier?" he asked cautiously. The man hesitated, his expression shifting. "No, just talking to myself." Michael didn't believe him. Before he could process what was happening, the car doors flew open, and 3 figures spilled out into the snow. They moved quickly, too quickly, and before Michael could react, they were sprinting toward him. Adrenaline took over. Michael shoved past the man and bolted for his car, his boots slipping on the icy ground. The figures shouted behind him, their voices barely audible over the wind. But he didn't dare look back. His only focus was on reaching his car before they did. He flung open the driver's door, jumped inside, and slammed it shut just as one of them reached for the handle. Michael jammed the car into drive and floored the gas, his tires skidding as he struggled to gain traction. For a terrifying moment, he thought he'd get stuck too, but the car lurched forward, spraying snow behind it. The headlights illuminated the figures briefly as he sped away. Their faces were shadowed, but their intent was clear. Whatever they wanted, it wasn't help. Michael didn't stop driving until he reached the nearest town, his hands shaking on the wheel. He immediately reported the incident to the local police, but they found no trace of the stranded car or the men. It was as if they'd vanished into the storm. To this day, Michael can't shake the feeling that stopping was a mistake, one that could have cost him his life. Whenever he drives alone at night, he can't help but wonder, what would have happened if he'd hesitated just a moment longer? Or worse, if he'd stayed to find out? The first snowstorm of the season had settled over the town like a thick, heavy blanket, transforming the familiar streets into an icy wilderness. Lucas had just moved into his new rental house. a creaky, old place on the outskirts of town. It wasn't ideal, but it was cheap, and as a young professional trying to save money, he wasn't about to complain. That night, Lucas arrived home from work just as the snow began to fall more heavily. He parked in the small driveway, stomped the ice off his boots, and stepped inside. The warmth of the house was comforting, and after a quick dinner of leftover pizza, he retreated upstairs to his bedroom to unwind. The room was small but cozy, with a slanted ceiling that reminded him of an attic. He set up his laptop on the desk by the window and began scrolling for something to watch. The soft glow of the screen was the only light in the room, and the muffled sound of wind outside made everything feel even more isolated. But then, a noise broke the silence, a dull, rhythmic thudding. It sounded like it was coming from above, from the roof. Lucas froze, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. The sound wasn't the random creak of an old house or the rush of wind. It was deliberate, as though something heavy was moving across the roof. He told himself it was nothing, probably snow shifting or a branch brushing against the shingles. But as the minutes passed, the thudding grew louder, more deliberate. It started at one end of the roof and moved slowly across, directly above his bedroom. Curiosity mixed with unease. Lucas grabbed his jacket, pulled on his boots, and stepped outside. The cold hit him immediately, and the snow crunched underfoot as he walked around to get a better look at the roof. He was expecting to see branches or maybe even an animal, but instead, he found something he couldn't explain. The snow on one side of the roof had completely slid off, forming a thick pile by the house. The other side of the roof was untouched, its layer of snow undisturbed. It didn't make sense. The wind wasn't strong enough to cause this, and every other house on the street still had snow evenly covering their rooftops. Lucas squinted up at the bare side of the roof, and his stomach churned where he saw faint impressions in the snow, footprints, heading toward the edge. He backed away, instinctively, his breath fogging in the icy air. Trying to shake off the growing unease, Lucas hurried back inside. As soon as he stepped through the door, though, his heart nearly stopped. There were wet footprints on the wooden floor, leading from the living room, down the hallway and up the stairs. His pulse raced as he stared at the puddles. Someone had been inside the house. They'd walked right past the living room while he was upstairs. Lucas followed the trail cautiously, his phone trembling in his hand as he dialed 911. The footprints ended at the top of the stairs, just outside his bedroom door. Lucas froze. He hadn't heard anything while he was outside, but someone had clearly been there. "I'm not alone," he whispered to the operator on the phone, his voice shaking. The operator tried to keep him calm, but Lucas's mind raced with fear. Suddenly, a movement in the corner of his eye caught his attention. He turned toward the window at the far end of the hall, and there, illuminated by the glow from a street lamp, was a figure. A person stood on the other side of the glass, staring directly at him. Their face was pale, their features barely visible in the darkness. Lucas froze as the figure tilted their head, watching him with an almost predatory stillness. Then, without warning, they stepped back and disappeared into the shadows. When the police arrived, the intruder was long gone. They searched the property and found no sign of forced entry. The wet footprints were the only evidence that someone had been inside. The officers told Lucas it was probably a random break-in, but the absence of stolen items and the strange behavior of the intruder left him with more questions than answers. As the weeks passed, Lucas couldn't shake the memory of that figure by the window. The police might have brushed it off, but he knew what he'd seen and what he'd felt. The thought that haunted him most wasn't just that someone had entered his house. It was that they'd been there the whole time, watching, waiting, and perhaps choosing to let him live.